maneuver for you now, Ed?
No, I think you're doing fine. What I'd like to do is get all the way out, Jim, and get a picture of the whole spacecraft. I don't seem to be doing that.
Yeah.
July 20th, 1969. Across America and much of the world, millions gather around television sets to witness what only a decade earlier had seemed impossible. For the first time in human history, mankind is preparing for a new frontier in the stars. Yet history has a curious tendency to become stranger with time, because almost as soon as the celebrations begin, questions quietly begin to surface that perhaps humanity's greatest achievement hadn't happened at all. Because sometimes, the more extraordinary an event becomes, the more difficult it is for people to believe they have witnessed the truth.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
This is State Secrets.
October the 4th, 1957, the world's press announces a miracle of the age. The Russians had successfully launched the first satellite ever to circle the Earth, and Sputnik hurtles its way into space to make a date with history that heralds the dawn of a new era.
By the late 1950s, the United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a struggle unlike anything the world had seen before. The Cold War has transformed global politics into a contest of ideology, military power, and technological dominance, with each side determined to prove that its system represents the future. Increasingly, that competition begins moving beyond Earth itself.
But Command Pilot McDivitt decided not to rush things. He elected to go for EVA on the third revolution.
In October 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Though small in size, its impact is enormous. For Americans, the launch comes as a shock. If the Soviet Union can place an object into orbit, many fear it may also possess the ability to deliver nuclear weapons across continents. The United States suddenly appears to be falling behind. In April 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin becomes the first human being to travel into space. The achievement is celebrated across the Soviet Union and viewed in Washington as another public defeat. Space is no longer simply science. It has become demonstration of national strength, technological superiority, and political ambition. And America is losing. Just weeks after Gagarin's flight, newly elected President John F. Kennedy makes an extraordinary proposal. America, he declares, will land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. The promise is bold.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Across the country, NASA begins building something unprecedented. More than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and contractors contribute to the effort. New computers are developed, rockets designed, simulations repeated endlessly. Every solution creates new problems. Every success carries fresh risk. The cost grows into the billions. And all the while, a deadline looms. The end of the decade. After years of setbacks, failed tests, and extraordinary cost, NASA is finally ready to attempt the mission President Kennedy had promised less than a decade earlier. Its name, Apollo 11. The crew consists of 3 astronauts: Neil Armstrong, a former naval aviator and test pilot, chosen to command the mission; Buzz Aldrin, an engineer and experienced astronaut responsible for the lunar landing systems; and Michael Collins, who will remain in orbit while the others attempt to reach the moon's surface. Each man understands the risks. No human being has ever attempted what they are preparing to do. On the morning of July 16th, hundreds of thousands gather near Cape Kennedy in Florida to watch the launch. Towering above them stands the Saturn V rocket, still one of the most powerful machines ever constructed. At 9:32 a.m., Apollo 11 leaves Earth. The launch proceeds successfully, carrying the crew into orbit before sending them on a 4-day journey toward the moon. For millions watching on television, the mission feels almost unreal. For NASA, however, the most dangerous phase still lies ahead. As Apollo 11 approaches the lunar surface, tension begins mounting inside Mission Control. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin transfer into the lunar module, Eagle, separating from Michael Collins, who remains alone aboard the command module Columbia in orbit above. Their task is deceptively simple: land safely, collect samples, return alive. Yet almost immediately, problems begin to emerge. As Eagle descends toward the lunar surface, computer alarms begin sounding unexpectedly. Mission controllers scramble to interpret the warnings. Then, another problem. The landing site appears unsafe, scattered with rocks and craters larger than expected. Armstrong takes manual control of the spacecraft, guiding it away from danger as fuel reserves begin dropping rapidly. Back in Houston, engineers calculate the margin for error. Then, at 4:17 p.m. Eastern Time on July 20th, confirmation finally arrives.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Inside Mission Control, relief replaces tension. Applause breaks out. But the mission is far from over. Hours later, with millions watching around the world, Armstrong prepares to leave the spacecraft. What follows will become one of the most recognized moments in modern history. And, for some, one of the most questioned. For Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, stepping onto the moon was only the beginning. During their 21 hours on the lunar surface, the astronauts conducted a carefully planned program of scientific experiments. They collected rock and soil samples, photographed the surrounding landscape, deployed instruments designed to study the lunar environment, and planted the American flag near the landing site. Every movement was documented. Every activity followed procedures developed and rehearsed over years of preparation. In total, Armstrong and Aldrin spent just over 2 hours outside the lunar module. When their work was complete, the pair returned to the lunar module, rejoined Michael Collins in lunar orbit, and began the journey home. The mission had achieved everything it set out to do. Yet for some observers, it was the very success of Apollo 11 that would soon become the source of suspicion. In the days following Apollo 11, the reaction is overwhelmingly positive. Newspapers around the world celebrate the achievement. Political leaders offer congratulations. Astronauts return home as national heroes. For most people, the moon landing represents a defining moment of the 20th century. The evidence appears clear. The mission has been broadcast live. Radio communications had been heard around the world. Photographs, film footage, and physical samples have been returned from the lunar surface. Yet, almost from the beginning, a small number of people remain unconvinced. Some of the questions seem straightforward. Why are there no stars visible in photographs taken on the moon? Why does the American flag appear to move, despite the absence of wind? Why do shadows fall at different angles across the lunar surface? Others focus on the scale of the achievement itself. How had America managed to place human beings on the moon less than a decade after its first manned spaceflight? And if the technology existed in 1969, why had astronauts never returned beyond low Earth orbit in the years that followed? At first, these questions circulate quietly, but over time, they begin attracting wider attention. The most influential claims argue that the moon landing footage contains visual inconsistencies that cannot be easily explained. To supporters of the theory, the images appear staged. The lighting seems artificial, the photographs look controlled, and the moon itself begins to resemble a film set rather than a destination. As the claims spread, a more provocative question begins to emerge. If the moon landing had been faked, who would have been capable of carrying it out? For conspiracy theorists, the answer appears obvious. Film director Stanley Kubrick secretly staged the moon landing for NASA. The theory emerged largely because of Kubrick's work on 2001: Space Odyssey, released just 1 year before Apollo 11. The film's groundbreaking visual effects depicted space travel with a level of realism audiences had never seen before, leading some conspiracy theorists to argue that if anyone possessed the technical ability to create a convincing lunar landscape, it was Kubrick. Supporters of the theory point to perceived similarities between scenes from the film and images from the moon landing, while others have claimed that visual anomalies in Apollo footage suggest the use of studio lighting or soundstage techniques. Over time, the idea evolved into one of the most recognizable elements of moon landing conspiracy culture. Yet despite its popularity, no credible evidence has ever emerged linking Kubrick to Apollo 11. Historians, filmmakers, and former NASA personnel have consistently rejected the claim, noting that such a deception would have required the cooperation and silence of thousands of individuals across multiple organizations. Nevertheless, the theory endures, perhaps because it offers a compelling narrative of its own, that the greatest achievement of the space age was not an engineering triumph, but the most ambitious production in Hollywood history. By the 1970s, the moon landing conspiracy had begun attracting a growing audience. What started as a collection of questions had evolved into a series of specific claims, each presented as evidence that Apollo 11 had been staged. For investigators, scientists, and historians, the challenge was straightforward. Examine the claims, test the evidence, follow the facts. One of the most frequently cited questions concerns the American flag planted by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. To some observers, the flag appears to flutter as though it were moving in the wind. Since the moon has no atmosphere, conspiracy theorists argued that such movement should be impossible. The explanation, however, lies in the flag's construction. Unlike a conventional flag, the Apollo flag was supported by a horizontal metal rod designed to keep it extended. As the astronauts positioned it in the lunar soil, the material continued to move briefly before settling. In the absence of atmospheric resistance, even small movements took longer to dissipate than they would on Earth. What appeared to be wind was simply physics. Another claim focuses on the lunar sky itself. Photographs taken during Apollo missions show a deep black backdrop with no visible stars. To skeptics, the absence seems suspicious. If astronauts were standing in space, where were the stars? The answer lies not in what the cameras failed to capture, but in what they were designed to capture. The lunar surface, illuminated by direct sunlight, was extremely bright. Camera exposure settings were adjusted accordingly, making fainter objects, such as distant stars, effectively invisible in the final images. Photographers encounter the same phenomenon on Earth whenever bright foreground subjects overwhelm dimmer background light sources. Questions were also raised about shadows. In many Apollo photographs, shadows appear to fall at different angles, leading some to suggest the presence of multiple light sources, similar to those used in a film studio. Investigators found a simpler explanation. The moon's uneven terrain, combined with wide-angle camera lenses and the intense brightness of the sun, can create the appearance of diverging shadows even when illuminated by a single light source. What appears unusual in a still image often becomes less mysterious when viewed in context. Perhaps the strongest evidence supporting the Apollo missions arrived not through photographs, but through physical samples. Across 6 moon landings, astronauts returned more than 800 pounds of lunar rock and soil. These materials have been examined by scientists around the world for decades. Their composition differs significantly from rocks found on Earth and has provided valuable insight into the moon's formation and geological history. For the conspiracy to be true, these samples would also need an alternative explanation. None has ever been demonstrated. Then there is the question of secrecy. By 1969, the Soviet Union possessed the technology to track American spacecraft independently. Soviet monitoring stations followed Apollo 11 throughout its journey, just as they monitored countless other missions during the space race. Had the moon landing been fabricated, the Soviet government would have had every incentive to expose it. Yet no evidence of such a deception ever emerged. Instead, America's greatest rival publicly acknowledged the mission's success. The deeper investigators examined the conspiracy, the larger the problem became. A staged moon landing would not require a single secret. It would require thousands. Engineers, scientists, astronauts, contractors, military personnel, tracking stations across multiple countries, all maintaining the same deception for more than half a century. For many researchers, that possibility seemed far more difficult to believe than the moon landing itself. Yet despite the evidence, the questions never entirely disappeared. Because the persistence of the conspiracy was never really about cameras, shadows, or flags. It was about something much larger. Questions that might once have been dismissed now seemed reasonable to ask. Official explanations were no longer accepted automatically. Skepticism had become part of the culture. As the decades passed, the theory evolved. Each new generation inherited the questions of the last. The conspiracy adapted to each new era, not because it was being proven, but because it remained compelling. A secret explanation behind a familiar story. Apollo 11 was an event almost beyond comprehension. In less than a century, humanity had gone from the first powered flight to walking on the surface of the moon. For some, the achievement felt so extraordinary that accepting it required a leap of faith of its own. And when an event seems too remarkable to be true, doubt can begin to feel more comfortable than belief. The irony is difficult to ignore. One of the greatest demonstrations of human ingenuity became, for some, evidence that such ingenuity could not possibly exist. The very scale of the achievement became the source of suspicion. And in that sense, the moon landing conspiracy may reveal less about what happened in 1969 than it does about the way people understand truth itself. Because facts can answer questions, but they cannot always overcome disbelief. On July 24th, 1969, Apollo 11 returned safely to Earth. The mission had lasted just 8 days. Yet in that short time, it has achieved something once considered impossible. For the first time in history, human beings have traveled to a new frontier, walked on alien terrain, and returned home. The achievement transforms science, engineering, and our understanding of what is possible. More than that, it changes the way humanity sees itself. For the astronauts who made the journey, one image would remain particularly powerful. Not the moon, but the Earth. Small, distant, and fragile against the darkness of space. For the first time, the world could be seen not as a collection of nations, ideologies, or borders, but as a single place suspended in the void. More than half a century later, the footprints left by Apollo astronauts remain undisturbed on the lunar surface. The landing sites are still there. The equipment remains where it was placed. Silent reminders of a moment when human ambition briefly exceeded its limitations. And yet, the debate continues. Not because the evidence has changed, but because belief is often shaped by more than evidence alone. Perhaps that is why the moon landing continues to fascinate us, because it sits at the intersection of two powerful ideas: the desire to believe and the desire to doubt. One asks us to look upward and imagine what is possible. The other asks us to look closer and question what we are told. Both are deeply human. But on one summer evening in 1969, only one of them carried us to the moon. And sometimes the truth is extraordinary enough on its own. And sometimes these truths are state secrets.